On Sunday night, March 29th, 2009, 48-year-old Valerie Looney pulled a fresh hot pizza from an oven at Pizza Plus, a busy restaurant in a small mountain town in Tazewell County, Virginia. Valerie slid the pizza onto a serving tray and then walked around the front counter and delivered it to a booth filled with local police officers. The officers thanked Valerie by name and then dug into their pizza. Valerie checked on the other diners, who had filled up almost all of the booths inside the restaurant, and then afterward, she headed around the front counter and went back into the kitchen. And there, she saw her husband, Harvey, standing by one of the pizza ovens. Valerie was short with cropped brown hair, and Harvey was a big guy with gray hair and a bushy beard. But despite the huge differences in their physical appearances, everybody who knew them thought they had always looked perfect together. Harvey pointed to the clock hanging on the wall by the oven, and he grinned at his wife. He said it was only a few more hours until their 29th anniversary. Valerie smiled back and then jokingly told Harvey to get back to work. Valerie had been the manager at Pizza Plus for over 10 years, and her husband Harvey had been working for her for the past 7 years. The couple knew a lot of people would shudder at the thought of working alongside their spouse day in and day out, but it was actually what Valerie and Harvey had always wanted. In fact, while other people might dream about, making a ton of money or traveling the world, all Valerie and Harvey ever wanted was just to spend as much time together and also with their son Chris as possible. And so Valerie and Harvey working together accomplished a portion of that goal. Harvey got back to work, like his wife had jokingly suggested, and he began to prepare some pizza dough for the next order. As he did that, Valerie stood up on her toes and gave Harvey a kiss on the cheek, and then she headed back into the restaurant's dining room. Pizza Plus was a really popular restaurant in this little town. The entire town only took up a few square miles, and it was surrounded by thick woods and then mountains beyond that, and at times, the people who lived there could feel isolated from the rest of the world. And so Pizza Plus had become almost like a meeting place where everybody could get together and feel connected to their community, at least for a little while. And Valerie and Harvey had really embraced that aspect of their work. The two of them always seemed so happy and welcoming to patrons. They wanted their customers to feel like they were hanging out with family when they were there. Valerie made her way through the dining room, and she checked in with the police officers to make sure their pizza was good. They told her it was delicious, as always. Then Valerie stepped towards the next booth, but she suddenly stopped and stared down at the floor. One of the police officers noticed and asked her if everything was okay, and Valerie smiled and said it was fine, but she quickly turned and marched right to the back of the restaurant. When she got there, she stepped into the supply closet near the back door, and she saw her employee, Brian Lee, bent down and stocking some shelves. Brian heard his boss approaching him, so he slowly stood up and he turned around. Brian was in his 20s and he towered over Valerie. Brian asked Valerie what she wanted, and she told him that before he went home tonight, he would need to make sure he mopped the floors in the dining room really, really well because she was just out there and they looked so dirty. Brian slowly exhaled and had to stop himself from snapping at his boss. Then he just said, "Okay, I'll mop the whole place after we close." Valerie could tell Brian was annoyed at her, but he was always annoyed when he was at work. For a second, Valerie thought about scolding him, but she stopped herself. Instead, she just thanked Brian and then turned and walked back to the front counter. Pizza Plus stayed busy the whole night until they closed around 10 p.m. Valerie and Harvey said goodbye to the last of their customers, and when the dining room was empty, Valerie walked to the counter and opened up the cash register. And while Valerie counted the money and did the paperwork for the night, Brian trudged out to the front of the store and began mopping, and Harvey cleaned up the kitchen and the back of the restaurant. And at some point, after cleaning for a while, Harvey picked up a large bucket of ice and shouted towards the front of the store to Valerie that he was going out back to dump the ice. Valerie responded by saying that Brian was finished with the mopping and she was almost done with the paperwork, so when he was done, they could leave. Harvey carefully picked up the ice bucket, walked out the back door, and dumped the ice onto a small patch of grass. And after he was done, he set the bucket down and Harvey just bent over at the waist, trying to catch his breath. He hated to admit it, and he would never want his wife or his son Chris to see him like this, but even the smallest physical tasks, like dumping this ice, had really started to wear Harvey out. And so after standing outside in private for a couple of seconds there, Harvey was about to go back inside when suddenly he heard screaming coming from inside the restaurant. And so instantly Harvey charged back inside, and the second he did, the screaming got louder and louder, and he called out for his wife, but then a second later the screaming completely stopped and the entire restaurant went completely silent. At 8:40 a.m. the following morning, a woman named Mary Fullen walked down the street towards Pizza Plus. She was on her way to open up the restaurant that day and then work the lunch shift. Mary passed a car wash not far from the restaurant, and she waved to a couple of people outside trying a car. Then she walked a bit further down the street and went around to the back of Pizza Plus. When she got there, she looked down and reached into her pocket to grab her key to the back door. But when she looked up, she saw Harvey laying face down right behind the back of the store. And so Mary ran over to him and began yelling his name, but as she did, she could see he was laying in a pool of blood. Mary shook him like it might wake him up, but she knew he was dead. And so in a total panic, Mary threw open the back door of the restaurant, barely noticing she didn't have to use her key to get in. And then once inside, she ran for the phone on the front counter to call police. But before she could even get there, when she was in the kitchen, she looked down and found Valerie, who was also on the floor, blood covering her hair and her clothes. It was obvious that she was dead too. And so Mary began crying and her whole body was shaking, but she still made it to the phone and she dialed 911. The operator told her police would be right there and that for now she needed to get out of the restaurant immediately. And so Mary hung up and just ran out the front door, not noticing that that door too was also unlocked. A few minutes later, the Tazewell chief of police, David Mills, pulled up in front of the Pizza Plus and just sat there in his car for a minute. When the call had come into the station, Mills and the small group of officers who worked under him couldn't believe it. They all knew Valerie and Harvey really well. In fact, they usually went to Pizza Plus as a group at least a few times a week. Mills looked out his windshield and he saw a couple of officers from the county sheriff's department standing with Mary in front of the restaurant, the woman who had called this in. Mills took a long, deep breath, then stepped out of his car and went up and joined them. All of the officers knew Mary about as well as they knew Valerie and Harvey. Mills could see Mary was a total wreck, and so while he didn't want to press her too hard, he did ask her if she could just fill him in on everything she had seen and heard that morning. Mary told Mills she'd been coming in to open the restaurant when she had found Harvey out back, and then when she ran inside to use the phone, she found Valerie lying on the kitchen floor. Mills told Mary he was so sorry she had to see that, and then he asked her if she had to use her key to unlock the door when she went inside. Mary looked like she hadn't even thought about this, and then she told Mills and the other officers that were there that actually the back door had been unlocked when she ran in. And also, now that she thought about it, the front door had also been unlocked when she ran back out again. Mills thanked her and then asked her to please wait outside. Then Mills and one of the county officers put on their gloves and walked into the restaurant. The sight of Valerie laying there on the kitchen floor, surrounded by a huge pool of blood, almost knocked Mills back. He had known Valerie for years, and he couldn't remember a single person ever speaking badly about her. It might sound foolish to people outside of the area, but as the manager of the local pizza place, Valerie was a huge part of this community. And sometimes, after a bad day, a good slice of pizza and a great conversation with Valerie could turn everything around. Mills and the county officer went over and knelt down and began to examine Valerie's body, and it was even worse than they thought. Valerie had several horrible wounds on her head and neck. In fact, she had been attacked so violently that she had almost been decapitated. After a moment, Mills and the other officer stepped back from the body, and they both just could not believe what they were looking at. This was not a town where homicides happen very often. And for these two officers, and basically all the officers on site, they had never dealt with anything this gruesome. Mills and the other officer collected themselves, and then Mills noticed that from where he was standing, he could see the front counter. And he noticed at the front counter was the cash register, and the drawer was open, and it appeared to be empty. So Mills's first thought was that somebody had come in to rob the place when Valerie was counting cash and closing for the night. And maybe Valerie put up a fight, and the robber attacked her and killed her. And then obviously at some point after that, Harvey must have gotten involved and gotten attacked and killed too. The investigators headed down a hallway to the back door and they stepped outside. And there, they saw Harvey's body on the ground. He did have one major wound, but it didn't look like the attack on him had been nearly as violent as the one on his wife. Mills knew they still needed to do a thorough sweep of the restaurant, but already just the sight of these two bodies made it clear to him that neither the local police nor the county sheriff had the resources to deal with a case like this on their own. There had not been a recorded robbery homicide in the county in 20 years, and as far as Mills knew, there had actually never been a double homicide in this area, and certainly not one that involved this level of brutality. So Mills grabbed his cell phone and he made a call to the Virginia State Police. And then after the call, he and the other officer went back into the Pizza Plus and began searching the entire restaurant. and it wouldn't take them long to find multiple pieces of evidence that seemed to paint a picture of a vicious struggle that had taken place the night before. Mills located blood spatter on the pizza ovens not far from Valerie's body, and he saw bloodstains in the sink, like maybe the killer or killers had tried and failed to clean up after themselves. Then Mills heard the other officer calling for him. The officer was standing a few feet away from the pizza ovens, staring at a fire extinguisher that was hanging on the wall. And when Mills joined him and looked at the extinguisher, he saw all these bloodstains on the bottom of it, and so it seemed like the extinguisher had to have been one of the murder weapons. A moment later, the two policemen left the kitchen and headed down towards the hall towards the back door again, where Harvey's body was. They had already searched the area once, but this time they were going to do a more thorough search. And this time they noticed a mop leaning up against the wall next to a bucket. Mills walked over to it and knelt down, and he noticed in the mop head were several pinkish spots that looked like blood. And what struck both investigators about this mop and the bloody fire extinguisher as kind of odd was that after both items had been used, it looked like they had been placed back where they belonged. They just kind of put them back as if nobody would notice. And so Mills and the other officer began speculating about who would do something like that, and they both agreed that, while this was kind of a flimsy theory, it seemed like maybe it was an employee who was responsible, because an employee would know where the fire extinguisher went and where the mop went. They both seemed to be back where they belonged, and so perhaps just kind of out of habit, they put those things back. A few minutes later, Mills and the other officer started yet another walk through the restaurant, and as they did, they heard several cars pull up out front. Mills stopped what he was doing and went outside, and there he saw members of the Virginia State Police and a state forensics team heading his way. A man wearing a dark suit extended his hand and introduced himself as Agent John Santola of the Virginia State Police. Mills shook Santola's hand, introduced himself, and said he was glad to have some help. Then Agent Santola and the forensics team walked inside the restaurant to take blood samples and look for other possible DNA samples, and as Mills stood there outside, something suddenly hit him. He would now have to go tell Valerie and Harvey's son, Chris, that his parents were dead. While state police searched the Pizza Plus, Mills and the county officer drove across town to the small trailer where Valerie, Harvey, and Chris had all lived together. When they got there, Mills walked up to the door and knocked, and shortly after, Chris answered. Chris was 28 years old, he wore a black sweatshirt and jeans, and he looked really confused to see two police officers standing there. He asked Mills if everything was okay, but Mills just shook his head and asked if they could come inside. Chris said, yeah, of course, and he let the officers in. And then once Mills and his partner got inside, Mills just turned to Chris, and with a sad look on his face, he told him that unfortunately, both of his parents were deceased. They had been attacked and killed at the restaurant. For a moment, Chris just stared at Mills like he was in total shock, and then he began shaking his head and said, no, that doesn't make any sense. Today, his parents were out of town on a trip for their 29th wedding anniversary. But Mills just shook his head and said he was very sorry, but that could not be true. His parents had not left town. In fact, they had never left the restaurant the night before. Chris eventually sat down and just stayed silent for a couple of minutes, and the officers just waited. And then, with a shaky voice, Chris said he should have known something was wrong when he didn't hear his mother and father come home the night before, and then also this morning when he didn't see them. But Chris said he had just assumed his parents got home when he was already asleep, and that they had left that morning before he woke up to go on their trip. But now he felt like it was obvious there had been an issue. Mills nodded his head and said he was sorry to have to do this, but he did need to ask some pretty pointed questions about his parents, and Chris just nodded. And so Mills asked Chris where he was the night before, and Chris said he had been at work, and then afterward he had come home, hung out for a bit, and then went to bed. Then Mills asked Chris what his relationship was like with his parents. Chris said their relationship had been good. He had been forced to move back in with his parents after going through a divorce, and he felt bad about it, but his mom and dad seemed happy to have him at home. After that, Mills asked Chris if he could think of anyone who might have had a grudge against either of his parents, and Chris just shook his head and said absolutely not. Everybody loved his mom and dad. Mills knew this was actually pretty much the truth. I mean, Harvey and Valerie were beloved in this town, so he wasn't surprised their son couldn't think of anyone. Mills said how sorry he was for Chris's loss, and he promised the police would do everything they could to get the person who had killed his parents. Then Mills and the other officer turned to leave, but then Chris told them to hold on for a second. Mills turned around, and Chris asked him if a guy named Brian Lee had been working with his parents the night before. Mills admitted they had not gotten that far yet, but he asked Chris why would it matter if Brian in particular had been working. Chris just said his mom complained a lot about Brian, and often got into arguments with him whenever they were working together. Mills thanked Chris for the information and said they'd be in touch, and then he and the other officer walked outside, got in the car, and headed back to the crime scene. And on the way, Mills called into the station and asked them to get in touch with Brian Lee. On March 31st, so 2 days after Valerie and Harvey's murders, Police Chief Mills and Agent Santola met Brian Lee as he walked into the local police station. Brian was young and very tall, and he already looked like he wanted to turn around and make a run for it. The news about the murders had spread through town almost as soon as cop cars started pulling up to the Pizza Plus, so Brian knew exactly why he'd been brought in. Mills and Santola led Brian to a small interview room, and inside was a table and chairs. Brian sat down on one side, Mills and Santola sat down on the other. And pretty much right away, what investigators noticed was Brian just could not sit still. And then, before the interview really even got going, Brian said something that totally threw off Mills and Santola. Brian wanted to know how much cash the killer had taken from the register. Now, nobody had told Brian that the register had been robbed, but the investigators knew this news could have gotten out pretty easily. Still, they were surprised that Brian's first question, when two people he worked closely with had been murdered, was about the money in the register. Agent Santola said they couldn't discuss those details with Brian. And then after that, he asked Brian to please talk them through the last time he had seen Valerie and Harvey. Brian said he'd been working with the couple on the night they were killed, and the place had been pretty busy. Then, once they closed, he said he mopped the whole restaurant, just like Valerie had told him to do, and then after that, he clocked out and he left. Now, right away, the mop stood out to Mills because they had found blood on the head of the mop. And so Mills, as discreetly as he could, asked Brian where he left the mop when he left. And Brian quickly said he left it close to the back door, where it was supposed to go. Mills followed up this question by asking if anybody else was still at the restaurant when he had left. Brian seemed confused, and he said, yeah, of course, Valerie and Harvey were still there. Valerie was doing paperwork, and Harvey was waiting for her to finish. After he said this, Santola just stared across the table at Brian, not saying anything, and this seemed to really make Brian uncomfortable. But Santola was not actually trying to intimidate this kid or anything. He was just trying to size him up to see if he fit the profile of the murderer. Brian was young and certainly looked strong enough and big enough to overpower the older married couple. But Valerie's murder had been so violent, so gruesome, that Santola really believed the killer had to have been harboring some deep anger against her. This just didn't seem like a crime that could be committed by a stranger. Santola finally broke his silence and asked Brian if he'd recently had an argument with Valerie, and Brian responded by laughing. Santola and Mills looked at each other confused. This was not the response either of them had expected. But then Brian explained and said that he and Valerie had a whole bunch of arguments all the time, because in his opinion, Valerie was a really tough manager and she was always riding him at work. And sometimes he just didn't want to put up with it, and so he snapped back at her and they'd get into these arguments. But then Brian noticed the investigator's reaction to his laughing, and he quickly stopped laughing and got a much more serious look on his face. And then he clarified by saying that, he might not have liked Valerie as a boss, but he would never hurt her. That was crazy. A lot of people don't like their bosses, but they don't kill them. Santola and Mills would follow up with a few more questions, and then eventually they would tell Brian he could leave. But as soon as he was gone, they both agreed that Brian was definitely a primary suspect. Over the following days, local, county, and state investigators looked further into Brian's background. And as they did that, they waited for results from tests that the crime lab was running on the blood samples that had been found at the crime scene. But while they waited, Santola and Mills did not want to overlook any possibilities. They both believed the most likely killer was somebody who worked at Pizza Plus, even if it turned out not to be Brian. So they went ahead and met with every single current employee. But when they spoke to Mary, the employee who had actually found the two bodies and called 911, she said she thought there might be another possibility. She said the car wash that was right by Pizza Plus was one of the main spots in town where people bought and sold drugs. And Mary said some of these buyers and dealers, who were pretty easy to spot, came into the pizza place quite often. And she said one of those people in particular, a guy named Homer, was really creepy. In fact, Mary and Valerie talked about how creepy Homer was. Mills got some information about Homer from Mary and then thanked her for the help. Now, Mills knew there had always been issues with drugs around that car wash, but these were not big-time drug dealers or anything. And so the idea that one of them had been crazed enough to rob the Pizza Plus and brutally murder 2 people inside seemed far-fetched. But still, Mary had said Valerie had been creeped out by this Homer guy, and so Mills and Santola couldn't ignore that. The investigators would track Homer down at the car wash, and at first glance, he really wasn't scary or angry or creepy or anything. He was just really quiet seeming. Santola asked Homer if he had recently spoken to Valerie or Harvey, and Homer would say he had seen both of them at Pizza Plus on the night they died, but he had not spoken to either of them. But Mills quickly jumped in and said that didn't make sense, because if Homer really went into the restaurant that night, he definitely would have talked to one or both of them when he was ordering or getting his food. But Homer shook his head and said he actually didn't go inside the restaurant. He said he had just sat in his car in the Pizza Plus parking lot, and then through the window, he had seen Valerie, Harvey, and all the other patrons and employees inside the restaurant. Mills was confused and asked Homer, wait a minute, you just sat in the parking lot watching people eat pizza? And Homer, whose expression was totally neutral, just nodded and said, yeah. And then he said after a few minutes of sitting there watching people eat, he drove home. Santola and Mills didn't know what to make of Homer. They tried to ask him questions to figure out why he was doing that and did he do this often, but really Homer didn't offer much of anything. He just seemed incredibly creepy. And so eventually, when the investigators left because they weren't getting anywhere talking to Homer, they got in their car and they're both like, wait, who is this guy? Was he a stalker? Is he casing the place so we could rob it later? Or is he just kind of strange and lonely? But whatever the answers were, the investigators now had another viable suspect. In addition to the Pizza Plus employee, Brian, they now had Homer. And they held out hope that when all the forensics evidence came back, it would point to one of them. On April 3rd, 2009, so a week after the murders, Pizza Plus was once again filled with laughter and conversation. The crime scene had been cleared, and now this was a gathering place once again. But this time, the community had come here not to eat pizza, but to pay their respects to Valerie and Harvey. There had been a funeral service for the couple at a local church, but everybody who knew them knew this restaurant is where they would want people to come, and they would also want people to have a good time. So Valerie and Harvey's son, Chris, and other members of the family thanked everyone for coming in and encouraged them all to take up seats in all the booths and just start sharing stories of all their favorite memories with the couple. And so over the course of the day, several local and county police officers came by the restaurant. Now, it's actually common for police to attend funerals of murder victims, basically to study the actions of people who were close to the victim, to look for suspects, but that was not why most of the cops were here today. So many of them had spent several nights a week in Pizza Plus, eating pizza and chatting with Valerie and Harvey. It was part of their routine. And so the officers were here to honor their memories, same as everybody else. In the days and weeks that followed the funeral and that memorial service inside of the restaurant, investigators continued to pursue 2 different theories. The first theory was that Brian, or another Pizza Plus employee, had some issue with Valerie or Harvey or both, and they carried out the murders as a result of that. The other theory was Homer, the man who had watched Valerie through the window from the parking lot, who also was involved in drugs, could have killed Valerie and Harvey because he was robbing the place for drug money. Or maybe he killed them for, some other motive that had not been discovered yet. And so police interviewed and re-interviewed everybody working at Pizza Plus, and they also expanded their search to include former employees. And simultaneously, they looked into people who were associated with Homer. But none of these interviews really led anywhere. And to make things worse for investigators, the test results from the crime lab came back as inconclusive. The forensics team had identified the victim's blood in the restaurant, but they could not find clear DNA samples pointing to anybody else. Eventually, Agent Santola got called away from the case to work on other state police business, and the case really began to weigh even heavier on Police Chief Mills, who now was basically running the investigation on his own. and pretty quickly, Mills began to lose sleep over this case. He felt like his team was always so close to solving the crime, but no new concrete evidence ever appeared, and so they never had enough to pin the murder on any of their suspects. Months and months went by, and then years went by, and still Mills could not figure out who killed Valerie and Harvey. And then eventually, when still this case had not been solved, Mills retired. And so with Mills gone and no new leads coming in, this double homicide became the only cold case in Tazewell County. And so family and friends had all but given up on the chance that Valerie and Harvey's killer would ever be brought to justice. But then, years after the murders, a new police chief and a new county sheriff decided that reopening and solving this cold case had to be their top priority. And they made a decision that would finally crack the whole thing wide open. On February 13th, 2013, almost 4 years after Valerie and Harvey's murder, a man named Rich Byington walked into the Tazewell County Sheriff's Department. Rich looked like an average middle-aged guy in a golf shirt and khaki pants, but he just so happened to be one of the most effective interrogators in the entire United States. Rich was so good, he actually taught other members of law enforcement how to interrogate, and he taught a very specific form of interrogation. It was known as the Reed technique. The new sheriff and one of his deputies met Rich as he walked into the building. The sheriff thanked him for coming in, and Rich said he was happy to help. Rich had spent the last several weeks going over the cold case and talking with past and present law enforcement officers who had worked on it. And Rich, like the sheriff, knew that these officers were smart, dedicated, and hardworking, but none of them had had any real experience interrogating murder suspects until the murders of Valerie and Harvey. And Rich believed that employing the right interrogation tactics with this case would make all the difference. He felt like he just needed a chance to sit down face to face with one of these potential killers. The deputy led Rich into an interview room, and both men would sit down on the other side of a table from one of the major suspects in the case. And not long after that, Rich began his interrogation. Among other things, the Reed technique creates a high-pressure environment for the person being interviewed, and it combines this pressure with words and acts of sympathy shown towards the suspect. And so Rich, who was famous for using the Reed technique, began using it during this interview. And throughout the interview, as planned, the suspect could never really seem to get their footing, and every time they started to look comfortable, Rich would throw a question at them or made an outright accusation that sent the suspect back into a panic. Hours went by, and the deputy could not believe that Rich just never seemed to tire. He just kept going, wearing the suspect down, and then making the suspect believe the police were really on their side, over and over and over again. And then finally, well into this interview, in this totally calm, caring voice, Rich laid out to the suspect what he believed had actually happened to Valerie and Harvey. And the Reed technique must have worked, because as Rich spoke, this suspect, who police had interviewed multiple times over the course of several years, finally broke down and confessed to everything. By the time Rich left the sheriff's department, investigators finally knew who had murdered Valerie and Harvey Looney. Based on that suspect's confession, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Valerie and Harvey at the Pizza Plus restaurant on March 29th, 2009. That night, around 10:30 p.m., the killer walked across the Pizza Plus dining room towards the front counter. There, they saw Valerie, bent over the register, counting out the cash. The killer cleared their throat to get Valerie's attention, and Valerie looked up, at which point the killer asked her a question. And when she answered, the killer started shouting at Valerie, but Valerie wasn't intimidated. She shouted right back, and soon the two of them were having a full-blown fight right there in the middle of the restaurant. And at some point, the killer got so mad and so frustrated that they rushed at Valerie, and Valerie screamed and tried to run away, but the killer chased her into the kitchen and grabbed her with one hand, then picked up a large knife with the other. Valerie struggled and fought, but she couldn't break free, and the killer raised the knife and slit Valerie's throat. Valerie fell to the floor, bleeding profusely, and the killer just dropped the knife. But suddenly, the killer heard shouting and footsteps coming from the back of the restaurant, and so the killer turned and saw Harvey charging down the hall. The killer rushed at him, and Harvey managed to punch the killer, but he quickly realized he was no match for them, and so Harvey turned and tried to run towards the back door, but the killer followed and managed to grab Harvey right by the door, and the killer wrapped their hands around Harvey's throat and began to choke him. Harvey fought as much as he could and managed to stumble out through the back door onto the ground outside. The killer scrambled to their feet and managed to grab Harvey's throat again and kept on squeezing. But at some point, Harvey managed to buck the killer off one more time, and the killer was about to re-engage for a third time when Harvey just kind of abruptly fell forward on his face and just lay there motionless. It would turn out Harvey actually just had a heart attack. And so the killer just stood there for a second, not really sure what to make of this, and then they turned and ran back inside to the kitchen. There, they saw Valerie face down in a pool of blood, but the killer wanted to make sure she really was dead. So the killer grabbed the fire extinguisher off the wall, stood over Valerie, and raised it up and began slamming it down over and over again into the back of her head. And after nearly decapitating her, the killer put the fire extinguisher back where it went on the wall, blood still all over it, and then they picked up the knife they had used to slit Valerie's throat. Then they walked out through the back door to where Harvey was still lying motionless on the ground, and just like the killer had done with Harvey's wife, they wanted to be sure Harvey really was dead. So the killer bent down and used that knife and slit Harvey's throat as well. After that, the killer went inside, they grabbed the mop and bucket by the back door, they went to the kitchen and filled that bucket with water. They grabbed the cash out of the register and pocketed that, and then they mopped their way out through the back of the store, trying to get the floor as clean as they could without spending too much more time inside of the restaurant. After wringing out the mop and emptying the water, the killer left the mop and bucket by the back door, walked outside past Harvey's body, and disappeared into the night. The following day, the killer went into work like nothing had happened, and then they went home and waited patiently for the police to arrive to tell them that their mother and father had been killed. Valerie and Harvey's son, Chris Looney, murdered his parents in cold blood. It turned out that after his divorce, Chris had been struggling with money. And so Valerie and Harvey had helped him for a while, but they had had enough. So on the night of the murder, Chris went to Pizza Plus one last time to ask for money, but Chris had already planned on killing his parents if they denied him. Because Chris knew his parents had a $245,000 life insurance policy, and Chris was the beneficiary. And so when Chris's mom refused to give him money and started fighting with him in the restaurant, Chris went through with his plan B. He murdered his parents and then stole the money from the cash register to make it look like a robbery. Investigators had suspected Chris once they learned about this life insurance policy, but it was also the placement of the fire extinguisher and the mop that made him stand out to the police. Mills and the other investigators had always suspected a Pizza Plus employee had carried out the murders, because the fire extinguisher, which was one of the murder weapons, and the mop had been put back exactly where an employee would put them, almost like it was habit. That was one of the primary reasons they had suspected Brian Lee early on. Now, Chris was not a Pizza Plus employee, however, when he was younger, he had been. And so over the course of several years, Mills and others felt like they were close to being able to prove Chris had done it, and they had interviewed him several times, but they could never find enough evidence or get him to admit to the crime. That is, until the new leaders of the investigation called in Rich Byington, the interrogation expert, for help. And after Rich faced off with Chris would confess to the murders and would tell police exactly how and why he had killed his own parents. Chris Looney was found guilty and was given 2 life sentences. After the trial, members of Valerie, Harvey, and Chris's family issued a joint statement. It said, quote, "Chris, we love you and forever will love you, but we cannot forgive what you have done." End quote. Pelican Valley is a beautiful, remote section of backcountry in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Its meandering meadows and creeks and 360-degree view of the mountains make it appear like the perfect place to camp out under the stars. But unlike other areas of the park, Pelican Valley requires a special permit if you intend to stay the night. And before Yellowstone Park rangers give you this permit, they remind you that Pelican Valley is a very dangerous place. And in general, you should only be out there with groups of at least 4 people. On July 28, 1984, 25-year-old Brigitte Fredenhagen, along with her brother Andreas and her sister-in-law Junko, arrived at Yellowstone National Park. That night, they stayed in one of the park's more established campgrounds called Grant Village. The following day, they headed out to one of the park's famous hot springs called the Norris Geyser. That afternoon, before heading back to their campsite, they made a pit stop at the park ranger's office so Brigitte could apply for a Pelican Valley permit. Her plan was to spend the following night in the valley. When they went in the office, the rangers believed all three of them were applying for a permit, and so they weren't asking that many questions. They were just kind of going through the routine. And then when Brigitte said, no, it's just going to be me applying for a permit, they actually immediately tried to dissuade her and said, this is a really bad idea. Nobody goes into Pelican Valley on their own. But Brigitte assured them that she was an experienced camper, she understood the risks, and she still wanted to go on her own. And Andreas and Janko, who were standing behind her, kind of echoed that sentiment and said, no, she's really good. She knows what she's doing. The park rangers were not thrilled with her plan, but they ultimately decided, you know what, if she wants to go, she can go. They just asked her to show them on a map where she intended to camp, so if they needed to, they could come and check on her and make sure she was okay. And so she pointed to a section on the map, and they handed her her permit, and then she, along with Andreas and Janko, left the office and headed back to their campsite. The next morning, the trio got up early and they hopped in the car and drove to the Pelican Valley trailhead. They parked their car, they got out, and they began walking into Pelican Valley as a group. After a few miles, as planned, the group stopped, at which point Andreas told Brigitte that they were going to head back now and that they would meet her tomorrow at the trailhead where they parked the car. They said their goodbyes, and then Andreas and Janko turned around and started walking back towards the car, and Brigitte carried on into the wilderness. The following day, Andreas and Janko arrived at the trailhead to meet Brigitte, but she didn't show up. And after a couple of hours, they grew very concerned, so they called park rangers and asked them, have you seen Brigitte? And they said, no, but we'll go take a look. The area Brigitte had told park rangers she was going to be camping was inside of a densely forested area right next to a large meadow, which meant as park rangers came up to check on her, they would not actually be able to see her until they were practically right on top of her. So the park rangers made their way through the meadow and into the forest before they started yelling for Brigitte, but she didn't yell back, and then at some point they reached the area where she had said she was camping, and sure enough they found her tent. But it was a very odd scene. When they came up to the tent, they could see there was a big tear in one side. When they poked their heads down and looked inside, all of her belongings in the tent were undisturbed. There was a foam sleeping mat right in the middle, and then to the right of the mat was a flashlight that had been turned off. On the left side of the pad was a tape player with headphones that she must have been listening to before bed. It had been left on until the batteries ran out. At the foot of the pad was her backpack, inside of which were all of her clothes that had been neatly packed inside of Ziploc bags to mask her scent. Also in the pack was a wilderness survival guide with a page flipped down that was a diagram of how to string your food up into the trees so no animals can get to it. The rangers looked around the backside of the tent about 2 meters away, and they found her sleeping bag perfectly flat on the ground as if it had been laid out to dry in the sun. But upon closer inspection, they found it had 2 puncture marks, one that was up near the neck of the bag and the other that was near the torso, but there was no blood on the bag. At this point, rangers started to speculate that this could have been an animal attack, but they were confused at the general tidiness of the scene. Typically, when an animal attacks a person, it looks like a bomb went off in the area where the attack occurred, and this campsite was very, very neat. As the rangers continued to walk around the campsite looking for clues and yelling out for Brigitte, they found a barely discernible drag tail a couple of meters away from the sleeping bag that was leading west into the forest and up a hill. And so the rangers started following this trail, and they got about 20 meters away from the camp when they discovered Brigitte's cooler lying on the ground on its side, and whatever food had been in there was now gone. There was some string laying next to it, so it looked like it had been strung up in the trees, but someone or something had gotten it down. From the cooler, the rangers continue walking along this drag trail another 20 meters or so up a hill where they discover a woman's sweater on the ground that's been torn up and there's blood on it. So at this point, the rangers get their rifles up and they keep walking another 40 meters up and over the hill down into this clearing in the woods where they find Brigitte, or what was left of her. No one knows exactly what happened to Brigitte, but the theory based on physical evidence is this. After setting up her campsite, Brigitte climbed inside of her tent, got inside of her sleeping bag, and then put her headphones on to listen to music. A little while later, a male grizzly bear discovered Brigitte's cooler strung up in the trees about 20 meters away. And apparently, Brigitte did not string it high enough because the bear was able to reach up and pull it down. After the bear ate the food inside of the cooler, it was still hungry, so it began looking around the area for more to eat. It's believed this bear was so accustomed to human traffic in the area that when he stumbled across Brigida's tent, he wasn't scared. In fact, he thought, there's food inside of there. There's people I can eat. So this bear quietly lumbers over to the side of the tent. It reaches up and cuts the nylon with its paw. Then it puts its head inside and bites down on Brigida's skull and begins dragging her away. There was no sign of a struggle in or near the tent, indicating that Brigida was most likely asleep, or maybe she just could not hear the bear because she still had her headphones in. She was dragged 80 meters by her skull to that clearing where she was consumed. An attack like this is exactly the reason why Pelican Bay is considered so dangerous, because it's full of grizzly bears. And even though grizzly attacks on humans are incredibly rare, most people do not understand just how horrific they are when they do occur. Grizzly bears don't really try to kill their prey before they eat them. Instead, they focus on pinning them down and then getting them under their body weight so they can't go anywhere, at which point they can eat them at a leisurely pace. Some say grizzlies actually prefer to eat their prey while they're still living, which is why so often in grizzly attacks you see the arms and legs eaten first and then the head and torso. This is a method that keeps the victim alive a little bit longer. Unfortunately, there was so little left of Brigida that investigators could not pinpoint a time of death. However, because this bear broke normal behavior and intentionally targeted a human, there's a good chance he savored that meal.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Blood on the Mountain.
On the afternoon of May 6th, 2008, a 54-year-old man called Ricky Williams stood on the riverbank casting out his line into the waters of Dismal Creek in western Virginia. Ricky was hoping to get lucky and catch some trout, but he'd been out here fishing for 30 minutes so far, and there were no bites. Normally, Ricky wouldn't care, because he loved just fishing for hours and hours at a time. But today, he and his dog, who was right with him, were really hungry, because they'd been out in these woods camping for several weeks now, and their food supply was finally dwindling down to the end. And so if they didn't catch any fish today, they might not eat. Now, for context, where Ricky was fishing, Dismal Creek, despite its bleak name, it was actually a beautiful, secluded spot on top of a mountain that was on the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail is a very famous 2,200-mile-long trail that runs up and down the east coast of the United States. And why that is relevant is because there's this special code for people that hike on the Appalachian Trail. And the code, which all hikers know, is basically if you come across another hiker on the Appalachian Trail, it is your responsibility to help them if they need help. And it is their responsibility to help you if you need help. So it's this community of hikers that are always looking to help each other. And so Ricky was very aware of this code on the Appalachian Trail, and he was secretly hoping, as he cast his line over and over again and didn't get any bites, that a hiker or a group of hikers might come by this area, and maybe they would see him and come down and learn that he needed food, and they might just give him some of their food. But another half hour passed and no hikers came by, and still Ricky could not catch any fish. But then suddenly, Ricky's dog, who was right next to him, began to whine and kind of began shifting around like it was sensing a predator in the area or something. But as Ricky was trying to calm his dog down, he began to hear a voice in the woods right behind him. Somebody was moving towards him. And when Ricky heard this voice, on the one hand, he was pretty excited because maybe this is a hiker who can give him some food. But on the other hand, Ricky couldn't help but feel really uneasy. Now, you need to understand that Ricky was an older guy, he was kind of frail, and over the past few weeks that he'd been camping with his dog, as his food supply had run down, he had become skinnier and skinnier and skinnier, and so he really did not pose any sort of threat to anybody. He's like this weak older man. Now, generally speaking, the Appalachian Trail was a very safe place. But over the last few decades, there had actually been several murders that took place on the Appalachian Trail. And in fact, one of those killings took place less than 2 miles away from where Ricky was fishing with his dog. And in that double homicide, a very well-known killer named Randall Lee Smith had stabbed and shot to death 2 hikers. And so while Ricky was really looking for help from fellow hikers, at the same time, he couldn't help but feel somewhat apprehensive. Because again, Ricky was like this small, frail guy, and Ricky was well aware of these murders, and he was well aware of the fact that he was super close to one of the murder sites. And so Ricky was totally on edge as he's listening to this male voice get closer and closer. And then finally, this man in his early 30s steps out from the tree line and he looks over and he sees Ricky. And for a second, the two men just kind of look at each other. But then this guy just grinned at Ricky and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And immediately Ricky felt relieved because he could tell just from looking at this guy that very likely he was not a threat. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston, and he told Ricky he was actually camping in the area with a friend of his, and they were out here fishing, just like Ricky. And Ricky pretty much immediately said, "Oh, great, nice to meet you. Do you have any food for me?" And Scott was like, "Absolutely." And he dug into his bag that he had with him, and he pulled out a couple energy bars and a bag of chips, and he threw them over to Ricky. And he also gave some fresh bait to Ricky, so he too could cast out again. And for the next couple of hours, Scott and Ricky just stood on the riverbank and fished together. And after a while, the trout did start biting and they did start catching fish, so the day kind of turned into a great outing for Ricky. And it got even better because as soon as the men were done fishing, Scott asked Ricky if he wanted to join him and his friend back up at the campsite for dinner. And remember, Ricky had no food, so this was an amazing invitation, and he said, "Yes, of course, I'd love to join you." So the two men packed up their stuff right as the sun was going down, and then they began walking back into the forest where Scott had emerged from. And as they were walking, Scott's fishing pole got tangled on a low-hanging branch, and he was really struggling to get it out of the tree. And so finally, he just told Ricky to, go on ahead. My campsite's right up there. It's a straight shot. Just go up the hill and you'll see it. Ricky asked Scott if he was sure, and Scott said, "No, it's totally fine. Go ahead." So Ricky said, "Okay," and he walked the rest of the way up the hill. And then when he walked out of the tree line into the clearing where Scott's campsite was, immediately what Ricky noticed was this enormous man who was like twice the size of Scott, and so 4 times the size of Ricky, kind of hunched over the campfire. And this huge man, who presumably was Scott's friend, he heard Ricky walk into the circle, and remember, it's nighttime and they're kind of in the middle of nowhere, and so this guy, he turns his head around and sees this strange man just standing there, and Scott's nowhere to be found, and so this guy, he grabs a club, like a piece of wood, and he looks at Ricky kind of menacingly, like, "What are you doing here?" And Ricky, who was so caught off guard by just how big this guy was, he put his hands up and he said, "I'm so sorry, Scott sent me up here. I don't know if this is the right site. I'm sorry." But just at that moment, Scott had finished untangling his fishing line, and he came out of the tree line and he patted Ricky on the back and he said, "Oh, you've already met my friend Sean." And as soon as he said that, Sean looked like he basically let his guard down. He put the wood down and he stopped glaring directly at Ricky. But Ricky felt like Sean was not happy that Ricky was in his campsite, even though clearly Scott is the reason that Ricky is in this campsite. And so Ricky just felt really uncomfortable. And at the same time, Scott is ushering Ricky closer to the campfire to take a seat next to Sean. Sean's a great cook. He'll cook up this fish for us. It's going to be great. Take a seat. Ricky felt kind of annoyed that Scott was really forcing him to stay, but Ricky didn't want to be rude and just kind of abruptly leave, so he did take a seat next to Sean, who definitely was not excited to be sitting next to Ricky, and Ricky just kind of sat there waiting to see what would happen next. And what happened next is Scott walked over to Sean and handed off all the fish that he and Ricky had caught so that Sean could begin to prepare them to cook them. And then as Ricky is still just sitting there right next to Sean, Scott walked away from the campfire up to his truck, which was parked right next to Sean's Jeep. And Scott turned on the radio and began blasting country music. And when Ricky heard this music, he kind of winced because to him, part of the reason the outdoors, the Appalachian Trail, being out in nature, part of the reason it was so wonderful was for the peace and quiet. And so it felt kind of like borderline disrespectful to be out in the middle of this beautiful place, blaring country music. And so to Ricky, he just couldn't help but feel like there's something off about these two guys. They just seem really disrespectful and kind of pushy and maybe aggressive. And so Ricky is just not happy. But again, Ricky didn't say anything and didn't attempt to leave because again, he's really hungry and so is his dog and he needs to eat that fish. A moment later, Scott walked back from the truck and took a seat next to Sean, and then he, along with Sean, pulled out their knives and began deboning the fish. And as they were doing this, Ricky again is just kind of sitting there doing nothing, and so he kind of meagerly asked, "Hey, can you give me a knife and I'll clean a fish?" but Sean and Scott kind of waved him off and said, "Don't worry, we got this." And so Ricky just continued to sit there nervously as all he could watch was the flashing of the light bouncing off their blades. But eventually, Scott and Sean finished deboning all the fish, and they put their knives away, and at that point, they began cooking the fish over the open flame. And suddenly for Ricky, it felt like, the mood had shifted a little bit. At least now the two men were not fiddling around with weapons. It felt kind of safe again. And so Ricky began making some small talk in hopes that would kind of, settle his nerves. And so Ricky told the two men about how much he loved the Appalachian Trail and how he came out here all the time for weeks at a time with his dog. And Ricky would tell the men that, sometimes he felt more at home out in the wild than he did at home. It was almost like being out in nature was a religious experience for Ricky. And he would even tell Sean and Scott that sometimes when he was out in nature, he would meditate and pray and even do some chanting like part of a ritual. I mean, he was really trying to be in tune with Mother Nature. But as Ricky continued to tell Sean and Scott about his personal life, he noticed the two men were definitely paying attention and kind of nodding along at appropriate points in the story. But at the same time, Ricky felt like these two men were also kind of looking at him like Ricky was kind of weird. As if they were not prepared to come out and say it, but after hearing all these things about his life, it was like, what's going on with this guy? And so Ricky suddenly felt really embarrassed about being so open with these two guys who once again just seemed like they don't quite like him or even really want him here. But luckily, right at that moment, the fish were done, and so the men just sat there in silence and wolfed down the food. By the time they finished, right about 8 p.m., it was very dark outside, and Ricky at this point is just ready to go. He just felt so uneasy here. And so after putting down his plate and his silverware and saying thank you to Sean and Scott for their hospitality, he quickly got up and grabbed his dog, and he began walking into the woods towards his campsite. But after Ricky and his dog had walked maybe 10 or 15 feet away from this campsite, two things happened in rapid succession. Number one, Ricky suddenly stopped and turned around and looked back at the campsite. And number two, right as he did this, there was this enormous bang sound, like a small explosion that echoed through the forest. About 30 minutes later, and about 4 miles away from where Ricky and Sean and Scott had been, there were these two women who were in their house eating dinner when they heard this sudden frantic knocking on their front door. Now, these women live in a very isolated part of the country, and so the women were very concerned. One of them rushed over to the phone just to be ready to call the police, while the other very carefully made their way towards the front of the house, and they kind of peered out the window, but they couldn't see anything outside. It was too dark. And so they went to their door, which was still getting pounded on by whoever was out there. And the woman, she unlocked the door and she opened it just a crack. And what she saw nearly made her faint. There was a man standing on her porch who was absolutely covered in blood, as if he had been fully submerged in a tank of blood. I mean, he is all red. And the man had his hand over his neck. And the woman who opened the door, she looked at him and she saw that there was this rhythmic pulsing of blood pumping out of his neck that was in time with his heart. This man is clearly bleeding to death. And so the woman, she screamed for the other woman to please call 911. We have someone who's dying here. And so she began calling 911. And then the man on the porch just said, please help me. And then he said something about Dismal Creek. And then he collapsed. And this was so shocking for the woman who had opened the door that she just stood there staring, having no idea what to do. But then she happened to look up and she noticed there was a Jeep that was idling out on the road in front of her house that she hadn't even registered until now. And so either this guy got dropped off or he drove that Jeep. But before she could even begin to understand what had just happened, an ambulance and a whole bunch of police cars came screaming up and parked in front of her house. And then the medics got out, they rushed up, and they grabbed the bleeding man, and they put him in the ambulance, and they rushed him off. Meanwhile, not far from the house, police officers were speeding towards Dismal Creek, because when the women called 911, they said, this guy who's shown up on the porch bleeding said something about Dismal Creek, but they had no idea what it was about. And so instead of trying to wait to figure out what was even going on, police had basically said, let's just go to Dismal Creek and look around and see if we can figure out, why someone would leave that area and show up at this house covered in blood. But as the police were making their way up this winding mountain road, they saw a truck bombing down the road coming straight at them. And the truck, they initially hit their brakes and did kind of attempt to get out of the way of the police cars. But after this truck had basically come to a stop, the driver of the truck just hit the gas all over again, and they veered wildly off the side of the road into an embankment, and they crashed and flipped several times and then came to a stop. And the police officers who had veered to the side of the road to avoid getting hit by this truck, they just watched this happen, and they couldn't understand why the driver had gunned it again after stopping and then seemingly intentionally drove off the road. It almost seemed like the driver was trying to crash. And so the police, they got out of their car and they approached the wrecked truck with their guns drawn. But when they looked into the vehicle, they saw there was a single occupant, the driver, and he was still somehow alive. So the police got him out of the vehicle and they called an ambulance, but they actually sent an officer with the ambulance to escort them because the police were actually pretty suspicious of this truck driver. Because remember, they were going up that road to get to Dismal Creek to see what had happened there that would lead to another man showing up on somebody's doorstep in the middle of the night covered in blood. And now they have this truck driver who looks like he's speeding away from Dismal Creek, who crashes his truck. I mean, there was no clear connection between the truck crash and the bloody guy, but the police were suspicious that they had to be connected. So they sent the officer to the hospital as well. About 30 minutes after the truck crash, the police left the scene and continued the rest of the way up the road to Dismal Creek. And once they got up there, the police fanned out all across the area and just began looking for anything. Just any clue that might explain what the heck happened here, if anything happened at Dismal Creek at all. And pretty quickly, the police actually did find something unique. In the middle of the Dismal Creek area, they found a campsite. But it was not the campsite where Sean and Scott were staying, where Ricky had gone and shared dinner with them. This was a different campsite. And not long after searching this other campsite, police concluded that whoever was staying here did not seem like they were mentally well. This seems like a mentally unstable and potentially dangerous person lives here. So the campsite was really simple. It was just a tent and a campfire. But when the police lifted up the flap and looked inside the tent, they found a collection of 30 knives along with a police scanner that basically picked up police radio chatter in the area, so you could listen to a scanner and basically know what the police were doing in your area. There were also all these weird piles of clothing. Some were for kids, some were for adults, some were for men, some were for women. There were piles of eyeglasses, and there were 8 pairs of women's underwear. And then also there was a map of the Appalachian Trail inside of this tent, and all over this map along the trail were all these spots that were circled, but there was no information about what these circles meant. However, one of the places that was circled was Dismal Creek. And then next to the map was a radio, and inside the radio was a cassette. And so the police just hit play, and immediately what they heard totally creeped them out. Because the tape sounded like some kind of satanic ritual. It was basically this one man's voice just kind of howling and chanting over and over again. But by far, the most shocking thing that was found inside of that tent was a single piece of paper. And this piece of paper was a birth certificate, and the name on the birth certificate was a name that basically all police in this area knew, and in fact, anybody living in or around the Appalachian Trail definitely would know this name. And the identity of this person, the name on the birth certificate, was the key to putting together all these seemingly disconnected events that had happened on this night. From the explosion when Ricky walked away from the fire, to the bloody man at the house, to the truck crash, they were all connected through this single person. A few hours earlier, after Ricky had gotten up and walked away from Sean and Scott's campsite, and then after barely making it onto the trail, he had turned around and there was that loud explosion. Well, at that point in the story, Ricky, who's now looking back at the campsite and looking at Sean and Scott, he can see that the two of them, they've heard the sound too, and they were now staring at each other with looks of absolute shock and terror on their faces. But then Ricky watched as Sean reached up and touched his face, and he put his hand out in front of his face and it was covered in red. And the reason for that was because Sean had just been shot in the face, because that loud explosion was the sound of Ricky shooting his gun at Sean. And as Sean and Scott stood there staring at each other in absolute disbelief, Ricky, who's still in the tree line, ran towards the fire and just kept on shooting. And so Sean, at this point, as he sees Ricky coming into the campsite, he stands up and kind of staggers back and falls on the ground. But Scott, who's not hurt at this point, he just gets up and starts running away from the campsite. And Ricky turns his attention towards Scott and he shoots at him and he hits him straight in the neck and also in the back. But somehow Scott just kept on running despite these horrible wounds. And so Ricky watched as Scott disappeared into the woods. And then Ricky turned back to Sean, who's laying on the ground and can't go anywhere. He's been shot in the face. And Ricky just casually raised his gun and shot Sean right in the chest. But amazingly, Sean, after getting shot this second time, it created what must have been the most extreme adrenaline rush ever, because he jumped up to his feet and right in front of his attacker, he just turned and sprinted to his Jeep. He hopped inside, fired it up, and just sped away as fast as he could. And when Sean flipped on his headlights and turned a corner after getting away from the campsite, he looked down the road and he actually saw his buddy, Scott, who had run away first, come tumbling out of the woods onto the road. And so Sean, who's gravely injured, drives over next to Scott and he stops the Jeep long enough for Scott to climb inside, and they shut the door and they speed their way towards the nearest help, which happened to be that house where those two women lived. And so it was Scott, who looked like he was drenched in blood, who knocked on the women's door. Sean was down in the Jeep out on the road, but he was just too weak to get out and come up to the door as well. But when the ambulance and police arrived, they would find not only Scott up on the porch, but also Sean in the Jeep, and both men would be taken to the hospital via helicopter. And then as for the man who was driving the truck down the road away from Dismal Creek, who then crashed right in front of the police, well, the driver of that truck was Ricky Williams. However, that was not his real name. There was no Ricky Williams. That was the name he just used. His real name, which was on the birth certificate that police found in that other campsite inside of the tent, was Randall Lee Smith. The same infamous Randall Lee Smith who had murdered those two hikers not far from Dismal Creek. That double homicide had happened in 1981, and Randall was caught and convicted. But he was paroled 15 years later in 1996 for good behavior. And for 10 years after that, Randall lived with his mother and he wore this electronic bracelet and, he followed the rules. But by 2008, his electronic bracelet had came off, and even though Randall had attempted to continue living with his mother, it just wasn't tenable, he didn't have enough money, and so ultimately he packed up his things, grabbed his dog, and moved out onto the Appalachian Trail. And on May 6th, 2008, when Sean and Scott arrived in Dismal Creek to go fishing, Randall was waiting. Nobody has any idea why Randall murdered those two hikers back in 1981, or why he targeted Sean and Scott in 2008. All we know is that Randall Lee Smith was very mentally unwell and very likely viewed the Appalachian Trail as like his sacred place. This is his home. This is the place he loves more than anything. And so maybe, he felt like Sean and Scott had somehow disrespected the Appalachian Trail, and that was enough to attack them. Now, we know Sean and Scott did not do anything intentionally disrespectful to Randall because, amazingly, Sean and Scott survived this attack. And they would say that when they saw Randall, they just felt bad for him. They thought he was like this alcoholic drifter who didn't have a home of his own, and so he was just living out in the woods on the Appalachian Trail. And so they didn't judge him. Instead, they really did just want to give him some food and spend some time with him and make him feel human again. That was it. And because Randall appeared to be this kind of small, older man, Sean and Scott, who were, very big and imposing, they didn't feel threatened by this guy. As for that bizarre other campsite that police found up around Dismal Creek, the one that contained all those knives and the birth certificate, well, obviously, that was Randall's campsite. And that weird cassette tape that they listened to that sounded like a satanic ritual, that was Randall going through his meditations and chants that he would do when he was out in the middle of nowhere. It was like his way of respecting Mother Nature and the Appalachian Trail. And then all those items that were found inside of his tent, the different clothes and the eyeglasses and the women's underwear, it's believed those could be Randall's other victims. However, when police pulled DNA samples from all of those items that were found inside of his tent, like the clothes and the underwear and the eyeglasses, well, those DNA samples did not match any of the missing people or murder victims in the police's database, and so that wasn't useful. And then also, police went to all those places on that map that were circled, and with the exception of obviously Dismal Creek, they didn't find anything else at the other locations that suggested any violent event had happened there. So only Randall knows the truth, which means we will never know the truth, because just 4 days after Randall was pulled out of that truck that he crashed, he died in police custody from a blood clot that formed as a result of the crash. And in those 4 days that Randall was in custody, he never gave up that there were any other victims. Today, Sean still has a bullet in his head and in his chest, and Scott still has big scarring on his neck and on his back. But both men have made a full recovery, relatively speaking, and they still go back to Dismal Creek all the time to go camping and fishing.
5:30 a.m. on November 13th, 1989, 16-year-old Amy Widener woke up coughing in her upstairs bedroom in Indianapolis, Indiana. Amy's throat burned. She glanced over at the clock on her bedside table and saw how early it still was. Now, normally she would have slept a bit longer before getting up and getting ready for school, but she just kept on coughing, so she knew she was not going to be able to fall back asleep. And she knew she needed to stay home sick today. Amy heard a knock on her bedroom door, and her mother, Gloria, walked inside, holding a 2-year-old little girl in her arms. Her mother said she'd heard Amy coughing, and she wanted to check on her. But Amy barely even heard what her mother was saying. Instead, she was smiling at the little girl. In a big, animated voice, Amy said, "Good morning," and the little girl smiled back, reached out her arms, and said, "Mamie," which was her name for Amy. This little 2-year-old girl was Amy's daughter. The girl's father was a friend of Amy's who was a couple years older than her, but he had never really played a role in the baby's life. When Amy's daughter was born, Amy had loved her immediately, but she had also been terrified. She had no idea how she was going to raise a child on her own, and she thought her life as a normal teenager was basically over. But Amy's mother, Gloria, had done everything in her power to make sure that didn't happen. Gloria had played a huge part in raising this little girl. In fact, Amy's daughter often called Gloria Mom. And Gloria's help, along with the help from some of Amy's teachers, had allowed Amy to not only stay in high school, but to thrive. Amy got good grades, she was a cheerleader, she played clarinet in the high school band, and she even tutored other students in French, a language she absolutely loved. She had dreams of going to college someday, and most people who knew her just assumed she would grow up to be a really cool French teacher someday. Back in the bedroom, Amy told her mother there was just no way she could go to school today with her cough. Her mother agreed and told her that she could still take her baby to the babysitter like she usually did during the week, but Amy said to leave her at home. It'd be nice to spend the day with her little girl. Gloria said okay, and then put the little girl on the bed next to Amy, and then she walked out to get ready for work. As tired and sick as Amy felt, she couldn't stop smiling. She loved that her mother had made it possible for her to still just be a teenager most of the time. However, she missed her daughter a lot when she was at school. And so a day like today, to be alone with her daughter was really special. While Amy sat and talked to her daughter on the bed, her older brother, JP, walked in. The siblings were only a year apart, and they were extremely close. They drove to school together every day and ran in the same circle of friends. And this close-knit group of high schoolers spent almost all of their free time together. JP told his sister to get well and said he'd see her when he got home from school. The house remained loud and full of energy for the next couple of hours while Amy's mom got ready for work and her brother and 2 younger sisters got ready for school. But eventually, everybody cleared out and the house became quiet. Amy continued to sit on her bed and just play with her daughter. In a house with 4 school-age kids and a baby, silence was very rare, so this morning felt extra special. However, that feeling quickly disappeared when Amy heard a door open downstairs. She figured one of her younger sisters must have just forgotten their backpack or something. So Amy cleared her throat and coughed a little, and then called out to see who would come home. A little before noon, a few hours after Amy and the baby had been left alone, Amy's mother, Gloria, pulled her car up to the front of the house. She had called Amy several times from work, but she hadn't gotten an answer. She worried that since Amy was sick, she might have fallen asleep, and she just wanted to make sure Amy and the baby were okay. Gloria got out of her car, rushed up the walkway, unlocked the front door, and walked inside. She called out for Amy, but she didn't hear anything. Then, as she walked through the front room and reached the bottom of the stairs, she froze. Amy's little girl was sitting on the landing at the top of the stairs all by herself, and she was crying. And she had blood on her pajamas. Gloria instantly ran up the stairs and picked up the baby and held on to her tight, and then she ran through the upstairs hallway and called out for her daughter again, but still didn't get any answer. Gloria reached Amy's bedroom and opened the door. She looked over at the bed and immediately began to scream. That afternoon, not long after Gloria had gotten home, Detective Norman Matthews of the Indianapolis Police Department parked in front of Amy's house and stepped outside. Police had already taped off the property, and Detective Matthews saw forensics officers scouring the front yard for evidence. Matthews also saw a woman standing with several uniformed police officers. The woman was crying, but at the same time, she was gently bouncing a little girl in her arms, doing everything she could to make sure the girl wasn't scared or upset. Matthews put on gloves, ducked under the crime scene tape, and walked into the house through the front door. More forensics officers were busy searching both floors of the house, and one of them pointed Matthews upstairs. Matthews walked up the steps, went down the hall, and into Amy's bedroom. A camera flashed as a forensic photographer took pictures of the scene in the bedroom, while Matthews just stood there inside the doorway, staring at the bed. There, he saw Amy Widener's lifeless body. Her face and her red hair were bloody, she was naked, and there was blood all over the sheets and on the wall above her. Matthews stepped closer to the body, and he could see cuts and a deep gash on Amy's forehead, and there was bruising on her throat, arms, and legs. The attack on this young woman looked vicious and uncontrolled, which was horrific enough in and of itself. But when Detective Matthews had gotten the call to come to this house, he'd been informed that this attack had taken place while the victim's 2-year-old daughter was present, and that information made this crime scene much, much worse. Detective Matthews met with the forensics officer who was working in the bedroom. The officer told him that amidst the blood on the wall, they had found what looked like a pretty clear palm print. The officer said the forensics team would carve out that section of the wall to make sure the print was preserved in its entirety, in hopes they could eventually find a match in their databases. For reference, in 1989, DNA testing was still very much in its early stages, and so it was not being used as an investigative tool by the Indianapolis Police Department. Matthews stepped out of Amy's bedroom and, along with several other police officers, started a full search of the house. The front door had apparently been locked when Gloria had come home to check on Amy and the baby, and there was no sign of forced entry. But Matthews and his team found that the sliding glass door on the back patio was unlocked. He also found that Amy's brother's bedroom looked like it had been ransacked. The dresser drawers were open, and it appeared that some pieces of stereo equipment had been pulled out of the wall and stolen. And so on the surface, this murder now looked like it could have been the result of a burglary gone wrong. Maybe someone had shown up to rob the place and heard Amy or the baby upstairs, and then just attacked and killed Amy like a target of opportunity. But as Matthews and his team combed through the rest of the house, something hit him. No other rooms looked like Amy's brother's room. There were no signs of robbery anywhere else. If this was a robbery gone wrong, Matthews figured that whoever did it must have been familiar with the house. They must have known exactly where that stereo equipment was and had come there specifically to get it. Matthews knew he did have a witness that might be able to identify the intruder, especially if the intruder was someone who had been to the house before. But there was a big problem with this, because that witness was just 2 years old. After Matthews and his team had completed their initial search of the house, he met with Amy's mother, Gloria, outside. Gloria was able to confirm that stereo equipment was missing from her son's room. She also said JP usually kept about $50 in cash in a dresser drawer, but that was gone too. Matthews told Gloria that this information was extremely helpful, but there was something more important that he needed from her. He needed her permission for police to question her granddaughter. The idea of putting her granddaughter through any more stress after what that little girl had been through that day made Gloria feel very uneasy. But her daughter had just been brutally murdered, and so she needed the killer to be found and brought to justice. So she agreed to Matthew's request. Gloria and Amy's 2-year-old daughter took a seat on the front porch, along with Detective Matthews and a police officer who specialized in working with young kids. And that officer introduced herself to Amy's little girl and then handed her some finger puppets. And then she asked the little girl to use these finger puppets to tell everybody what had happened that morning. And then that officer and the others watched and listened as the little girl used the finger puppets to act out a scene. She made it look like 2 of the puppets were fighting for a little while, and then she said later on, Mamie was laying on the bed. The little girl had said she had tried to lift Mamie up, but then said Mamie was just too heavy. When Gloria heard her granddaughter say this, she just broke down, and Matthews and the other officer tried not to show how much this affected them. The fact that this little girl had clearly seen her mother get murdered was not something they could just shake off. Eventually, the officer who specialized in working with young kids asked the little girl one more question. Did she know the person who had come into Mamie's room? But all the little girl could remember was that the person was Strong. Detective Matthews told the little girl what a great job she'd done, and then he asked Gloria if he could speak to her alone for a minute. Gloria told her granddaughter to stay with the police officer and she'd be right back. Then she followed Matthews off the porch. Matthews told her that the fact her son's room was the only room that had been robbed led him to believe that the killer was very likely another young person who her kids knew. And very likely they knew in advance that the stereo equipment and the $50 would be in JP's room. So Matthews asked Gloria to come up with a list of names of people who were closest to Amy and JP. Gloria said that Amy and her brother JP hung out with a small group of friends, but she said there was someone outside that group that Matthews should definitely talk to before anybody else. The father of Amy's child, a young man named Tony Abercrombie. And sure enough, the day after the murder, Detective Matthews brought Tony into the station for an interview. Tony was 18 years old, tall with long wavy brown hair, and he wore jeans and a t-shirt. He looked to Matthews like almost every other teenager in the area. The night before, Matthews had seen Tony giving an impromptu interview about Amy's murder on a local news show, and Matthews didn't really know what to think about that. The reporter had most likely shown up at Tony's house unannounced, and it could be difficult for a young man like Tony to tell a reporter to leave him alone, but there was also the possibility that Tony craved the attention. There were plenty of homicide cases throughout history where the killer went out of their way to get their name in the news. However, Matthews was not ready to jump to any conclusions like that. And now, looking at Tony across the table, he could tell this kid seemed very upset and maybe even a bit scared. Matthews told Tony he was not in any kind of trouble. The police just needed to know some things about his relationship with Amy. Tony nodded and told Matthews he'd been good friends with Amy's brother JP. That's how he had met Amy. He said they'd gone out a few times and then ended up sleeping together, and Amy got pregnant. Tony admitted that the idea of becoming a father at his age scared him, and he was not looking forward to the birth of the baby. However, when the baby was born, Amy and Gloria had basically raised her without him. So Tony said he hadn't talked much to Amy since then or had anything to do with his child. He told Matthews he'd gotten a phone call from Amy's friend that Amy had been killed on the morning it happened. Tony said he'd felt completely torn up when she had told him, and in fact, he had to leave work because he was so upset. Tony said he might not have seen Amy very much lately, but he still cared about her. And on top of that, she was one of the sweetest people he'd ever met. It didn't make sense that somebody would want to hurt her. Shortly after that, Matthews got Tony's work details and then told him police would follow up if they needed more information. And then he let him go. Matthews needed to see if Tony really had been at work on the morning Amy had been killed. But based on this one interview he had just done, Tony did not seem like the type of person who had done that TV interview to draw attention to himself. Instead, he just seemed like a kid who was very upset that a girl he'd been with and fathered a child with was now gone. In the days immediately following the murder, the investigative team started to look into a range of Amy's friends and classmates, believing the person who broke in and killed her was most likely someone Amy knew. But, based on what he'd seen at Amy's house, Detective Matthews had also developed a new theory. Maybe there hadn't been a break-in at all. Maybe Amy's brother JP had killed her and then ransacked his own room to try to throw off the police. So, Detective Matthews met with JP multiple times. And in every meeting, JP made it very clear how angry and upset he was that police would even think he could do something like this to his sister. He said he loved Amy, maybe more than anybody else in the whole world. They had been so close ever since they were little kids. But despite these multiple interviews and Detective Matthews' continued interest in JP, the detective did not find anything linking him directly to the crime. His fingerprints were all over the house, including inside of Amy's room, but that was expected. He lived there, so it really didn't mean anything. And there was nothing JP did in the aftermath of the murder that added more suspicion to him. In fact, JP just seemed devastated by the loss of his sister. And then on November 17th, so 4 days after Amy's murder, when Amy's friends and family all gathered together for her funeral, JP shared countless stories about some of the best times he'd spent with his sister. He said because they were so close in age, it was like they weren't just siblings. They were more like really good friends. At the funeral, JP, along with JP and Amy's mutual friend Rodney and some of Amy's girlfriends, did their best to try to console Amy's younger siblings and her mother Gloria. But it felt like an impossible task, because none of them could accept that this had really happened. Following the funeral, Detective Matthews and his team collected the guest book and made a note of everybody at the service who'd signed the book. Many of the guests had been Amy's classmates and her teachers. And so Matthews and his team first met with some of the high school students on the list that they had not already spoken to. But none of these interviews really led anywhere. All of them just sort of ended with the students talking about how much they were going to miss their friend. And at the same time, Matthews still didn't have any real concrete evidence, like any information on the bloody palm print that had been found in Amy's room. So one afternoon, in the week following the murder, Matthews walked down a long hallway lined with lockers at Amy's high school. School was already out, so there were only a handful of students who were still there. Matthews turned down a different hallway with classroom doors on either side and found the French classroom. He walked in and saw Amy's French teacher, Jody George, waiting for him. Matthews had heard from several people that Jody was Amy's favorite teacher, and so he told Jody this, and this immediately made Jody break down into tears. She told the detective that Amy had always been a great student, but the real reason that she and Amy had connected was actually because they both had been raising babies at the same time. Jody's child was born not too long after Amy's daughter had been born, and so Amy and the teacher shared parenting tips with each other and bonded over being new mothers. Matthew's hope was that in meeting with Jody, that perhaps she could point him towards other students who were maybe Amy's friends, but who didn't attend the funeral. Detective Matthews ended up getting a list of students that Amy had tutored in French, and he asked Jody if any of these kids might have had a problem with Amy. But Jody said no, not that she knew of. And then over the next several days, as Matthews went down this new list of students, it didn't really go anywhere. Because once again, all these students could say was just that they really liked Amy, and they couldn't believe she was gone. By the end of November, about 2 weeks after the murder, Matthews felt like he had spoken to every high school kid in town, and he still wasn't any closer to finding Amy's killer. Tony Abercrombie, the father of Amy's daughter, looked like he had a solid alibi, as did her brother JP, who was seen in class by multiple people at the time his sister was killed. And when Matthews finally got the results on that bloody palm print that had been on the wall in Amy's room, it didn't match Tony or JP's prints. It also did not match any of Amy's friends that police had interviewed, or any prints in any criminal database. So Matthews felt like he basically had nothing. and now he wondered if he'd just been plain wrong the whole time. Maybe Amy didn't know her killer, and it was just some random stranger that had broken into the house and killed her. And if that was the case, it meant the suspect pool could basically include almost anyone. Matthews and his team continued to follow any potential leads, and they returned to the crime scene to see if there was anything they might have missed. But as 1990 began and several more months passed, it became clear the police had no real suspects. Amy's family still got together with Amy's friends and that French teacher Jody to share stories and keep Amy's memory alive, but most of them came to believe that her murder would never be solved. And as even more time went by with no new leads, some members of the investigative team started to feel the same way. And eventually, Detective Matthews and the rest of the investigative team had to focus on new cases. And so Amy's murder case went cold, and it would stay that way for a long, long time. Fast forward to 2002, so 13 years after Amy's murder. Detective Roger Spurgeon, the lead cold case detective at the Indianapolis Police Department, got a call at his desk. And when he answered, he heard a man's voice, and this man sounded totally afraid. The man told the detective that the previous night he had had these horrible dreams about the murder of Amy Widener that had taken place back in 1989. The man said he worked at the school where Amy had gone, so he had known her, but not very well. But now he was having these visceral dreams about her death, and so he felt like he just needed to pass on what he was seeing in these dreams because he believed maybe it could help police solve the murder, which in turn could make these terrible dreams go away. Detective Spurgeon just sat at his desk, stunned by what he was hearing. Getting bizarre phone calls about old homicide cases was not totally unheard of. Usually they didn't lead to anything. But this man sounded genuinely upset. And so, operating on a hunch, Spurgeon took down notes on these dreams the caller was having. And after the call was over, Spurgeon pulled Amy's case file. The caller's supposed dreams did give a lot of details about Amy's murder. But for the most part, these details had all been covered in the press at the time of Amy's death, or in the years following. Spurgeon figured this caller was not the most dependable source, but he couldn't just let this go. After all, this man could have details about the murder, not because he was dreaming it, but because he was involved. And so the detective dug into this man's background, and he discovered that he did in fact work at Amy's high school, like he had said. So Spurgeon went to the school and met with several teachers and administrators who knew the caller, and many of them had actually worked at the school when Amy was killed as well. Now, during these initial few conversations, nothing really stood out to Spurgeon, but then the school's guidance counselor told Spurgeon something that was really strange. They told him that they knew who the man was who claimed to have these dreams about Amy, and they said this man could not have killed her, because on the morning of Amy's murder, that man, the caller, had been working at the school. And the guidance counselor said on the day of the murder, this person, this man, kind of out of nowhere, had this violent episode where he just started screaming and kicking things. In fact, his episode had gotten so bad that eventually the counselor had to help the man out of the school and drive him home. This was definitely a new one for Detective Spurgeon. He'd gotten some strange calls before, but this man's dreams and now his episode on the morning of the murder were something else. Spurgeon followed up with the man who had called him about his dreams, and he even re-interviewed several people who'd been connected to the initial murder case. But just like during the initial investigation, nothing came out of these interviews. After several months of looking into the case again, the detective had nothing new. And so Amy's killer remained unknown and free. And soon her case went cold again. And it would stay that way for almost another decade. On a morning in 2011, so 22 years after Amy's murder, Sergeant Bill Carter, a nuisance and abatement officer with the Indianapolis Police, sat in a small office scrolling through Facebook. A nuisance and abatement officer is a cop who works directly with the fire inspector to check on venues like restaurants and clubs that might be breaking fire code. And so Sergeant Carter spent a lot of his time looking at Facebook to see if any events or big parties were being talked about that would potentially violate fire code laws. Just then, Carter heard a knock on his door. He said to come on in, and he looked up to see a homicide detective standing there. This was definitely weird, because Carter had very little interaction with the homicide department. The homicide detective said he was heading up cold cases now, and recently he'd found a Facebook page dedicated to the victim of one of the coldest cases they had, the Amy Widener murder from 1989. Carter said he knew about the case. It had been in the news off and on over the years since it happened, and he'd also grown up in the same part of town as Amy. But none of this explained why a homicide detective would be coming to see him about this case. The homicide detective said he wanted to print off everything from this Facebook page dedicated to Amy to add it to the case files, and to cross-check some of the people on the page with people mentioned in the original investigation. The problem was that he and the other homicide detectives didn't know how to print things off of Facebook, so he was hoping Carter could help them. Carter stifled a laugh and said he'd take care of it. The homicide detective walked off, and then Carter quickly found the Facebook page called Remembering Amy Widener. Even though Carter was familiar with the case, seeing photos of Amy as a happy teenager really hit him. And as he read through the comments on the page, he saw how many people were still deeply affected by this murder. It just seemed so wrong that her friends and family had gone this long without any kind of closure. And so Carter printed out everything from the Facebook page for the homicide detective, but before he did, he sort of read through it all. And as he did, he started to feel like he really needed to do something to help. Over the next several weeks, in his free time, Sergeant Carter started to look through the old case files for Amy's murder. Now, normally, homicide detectives would not have wanted an officer from another department anywhere near their files, especially an officer who only dealt with fire codes. But Amy's case had remained unsolved for so long that they figured whatever Carter was doing couldn't hurt. Sergeant Carter regularly checked the Facebook page dedicated to Amy, made notes on the pages he'd printed, and tried to see if he could connect anything to something in the original case files. He even reached out to several of Amy's friends and family members who'd been interviewed in the past to see if they had any new information to offer. For months, Carter's efforts weren't much different from the detectives who'd worked the case in the past. No new leads, no new evidence. Carter stuck with it, continuing to work Amy's case whenever he had the time. And on a day in June of 2012, now closing in on 23 years after Amy's murder, Sergeant Carter caught something in the case files that seemed to have gone overlooked for decades. At first, Carter thought he had to be wrong. Maybe he'd been spending so much time with the case looking at countless pieces of paper and file folders that he'd just gotten confused, or he was delirious or something. But when he looked at what he'd found in the case file again, and checked it with the Facebook page and the notes he'd taken from the interviews he'd conducted, he was sure he had found something huge, something that apparently no other investigator had noticed. Sergeant Carter looked through the files one more time, found a phone number, grabbed his cell phone, and made a call. And he told the person who answered that he needed to speak to them as soon as possible about Amy's murder. On June 27th, Carter headed over to this person's house to meet them. But when he got there, the person was gone and nobody seemed to know where they went. Soon, Carter found this person had emptied all their bank accounts, quit their job, and just disappeared without a word to anybody. Sergeant Carter couldn't believe it. For the first time in over 20 years, Indianapolis police thought they might be getting closer to solving Amy's murder. But now the person they needed to talk to had fled. And for all Carter knew, this fugitive could be halfway around the world already. A little over a week later, in early July, Carter was at the station with other officers from several departments. A team of Indianapolis police had been working with different agencies to try to track down the fugitive that they believed might be connected to Amy's murder. And now they were waiting to hear something, anything, that might help with their investigation. And luckily for Carter, it didn't take long for him to get what he wanted. And that day, a very excited officer approached Carter and the others. And he said, using credit card data, investigators had discovered that the fugitive had rented a car in town. And using that rented car's OnStar security service, they now knew exactly where that car was parked. Carter asked where it was, half expecting it to be on the other side of the country or somewhere across the border. But the officer said that was not the case at all. The rental car was at a house right here in Indianapolis. Minutes later, police cruisers roared down a residential street and pulled up to a house. Carter and the other officers got out of their cars and quickly approached the front door. Right there in the driveway was the fugitive's rental car. As Carter prepared to knock on the door, several other officers around them put their hands on their holsters, ready to draw their weapons. They didn't know if the fugitive was even inside, but they had to be prepared for anything. Once they were ready, Carter knocked on the door. Moments later, a man answered. Carter told the man who they were looking for, and as soon as he did, suddenly there was a scream coming from inside the house. Carter and several other officers bolted inside, and they found the fugitive standing there in the kitchen. And there was blood running down from the slash on their wrist, and they were holding a knife to their own throat, threatening to kill themselves if the cops came any closer. Carter and the other officers took a breath and tried to keep everybody calm. Several officers talked to the fugitive, urging them to put the knife down and to get medical help. And slowly, the tension in the room eased a bit, and the fugitive did drop the knife. At that point, officers rushed the fugitive, trying to stop the bleeding from their wrist, while making sure the fugitive couldn't hurt themselves, or any of the officers, or try to make a run for it. An ambulance soon arrived, and paramedics sped the fugitive to the hospital, with police following closely behind. And luckily, the fugitive got medical help just in time. And later that day, after Carter and other investigators got to meet with the fugitive in the hospital, they finally figured out, after more than 20 years, who had killed Amy Widener. Based on information from the fugitive's statements, evidence found at the murder scene, and interviews conducted over the course of multiple investigations, the following is what police believe happened to Amy Widener on the morning of November 13th, 1989. On that day, just after 7:30 a.m., the killer walked through the first floor of Amy's house. They moved slowly, and in their hand they gripped a metal pipe. The killer stopped at the bottom of the stairs and listened. They thought they heard someone coughing and maybe some laughter coming from the second floor. The killer walked up the stairs as slowly and quietly as they could, and then crept down a hallway towards Amy's bedroom where they heard the noises. Once they reached the door, they threw it open and they saw Amy sitting up in bed with her little girl. Amy screamed and put her baby down on the floor, then she climbed out of bed and leapt at the killer. Amy threw her fists at the killer and fought back as hard as she could as the little girl ran out of the bedroom. The killer wrapped their arms around Amy and shoved her back onto the bed. Amy kept fighting, but the killer raised the metal pipe and struck Amy on the arms and chest, stunning her. Then the killer took off Amy's clothes and sexually assaulted her. But through it all, Amy continued to fight back, constantly slashing at the killer until the killer was bloodied. But at some point, the killer managed to steady themselves against the wall. They raised their metal pipe again, and they slammed it directly into Amy's forehead. At that point, Amy stopped moving. The strike in her head had killed her. But the killer wanted to be sure she really was dead. So after that, they wrapped their hands around Amy's throat, and they strangled her until they knew she had stopped breathing. Then the killer got up and ran out of the room and down the hall, right past Amy's young daughter. Once the killer was back downstairs, they went into JP's room, threw open the dresser drawers, and grabbed the $50 out of one of them. After pocketing the money, they picked up some stereo equipment and then ran out of the house through the sliding door that led onto the back porch. As the killer ran away, they just hoped nobody had seen them and that maybe they would get away with the horrific act they had just committed against their best friend's sister. Rodney Dank, who was JP's best friend and who would remain close to the family following Amy's murder, had been Amy's killer. It turned out he was able to get away with his crime for over 20 years simply because of an oversight. Initially, the police had Rodney listed as one of Amy's close friends that they would need to interview. But for some reason, nobody ever spoke to him. Rodney did not get questioned in the initial investigation or in the secondary investigation when that man had called in to tell police about his dreams. This oversight was what Sergeant Carter, the nuisance and abatement officer, noticed when he started digging into Amy's case in his spare time. He saw Rodney's name listed in the guest book from Amy's funeral, and then he found Rodney mentioned in other notes from the investigation. But he didn't see any record of Rodney ever being interviewed. So Carter tracked Rodney down and set up a meeting with him. At the time, Carter did not have any idea if Rodney had a connection to the murder or if he could even offer any information. He just wanted to speak to Rodney because nobody ever had. But when Carter went to meet Rodney and realized he had fled, that immediately made Rodney the first major suspect the police had in the case in 2 decades. After police finally caught up to Rodney, they discovered that his palm print matched the bloody print found in Amy's room. And while Rodney was recovering in the hospital, he would confess to what he did to Amy. However, in his confession, he did not make it clear if he had gone to the house with that intent, or if he had simply gone there to rob his best friend JP, and then she had been a target of opportunity. It was also never clear if the man who had called the police in 2002 really experienced those dreams that supposedly showed Amy's murder. And police also don't know what caused that man's violent episode on the day Amy died. However, they do know that that particular man who called in about his dreams had absolutely no involvement in Amy's death. Ultimately, Rodney Dank was sentenced to 65 years in prison. Sergeant Carter was named Investigator of the Year by the Indianapolis Police Department based on his work on this case. As for Amy's daughter, she was raised by Amy's mother, Gloria. And when she reached high school, she actually had Jody George, Amy's favorite teacher, for French. And when she graduated, Jody would tell her, "I just remember so many things about your mother and how your mother felt about you. And I know your mother would be so proud of you right now."
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events. But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In 1989, 22-year-old Eloise Lindsay was a fresh college graduate, and she was at a crossroads in her life because even though she just earned her degree, she really didn't know what she wanted to do with her life. And because she was an experienced backpacker, she thought a good way to, kind of get her life together would be to go on a sort of retreat, go out into the woods, go out into nature, and kind of find herself. So she had planned this very detailed 43.3-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail, starting in South Carolina, where the first 7 days of the hike she would be totally on her own, and then at the 7-day mark she would meet up with a friend at a particular rendezvous point. Her friend would give her resupplies and would be her companion for the rest of the hike. When Eloise told her parents what her plans were, they were not concerned for her safety because she was an experienced backpacker. She had made trips like this before. And so they said, "Great, we'll see you when you get back." So on November 4th, Eloise sets out to begin her journey down the Appalachian Trail. And the first couple of days of her hike were great. The weather was beautiful, the scenery was amazing, and she had all this time to just kind of be by herself and look internal and think hard about what she wanted to do with her life. But on the third day, when she woke up, she was sleeping inside of a tent she had camped just off the trail. She woke up and she had this intense sense of dread. She couldn't really place where it was coming from, but she knew something was wrong, and she's kind of doing inventory of her life, like, what did I forget? Is there something that I'm just not thinking about right now? But she kind of pushes it aside mentally and thinks, okay, you know what? I'm just going to pack up my campsite here and get hiking, and I'm bound to, come up with what it is that's making me feel this way. So she gets out of her tent and she begins packing up her campsite, and she's looking out, kind of scanning the tree line, not because she was looking for anything, but just because she happened to be looking out. And she could have sworn that she saw a man standing, 30, 40 feet away behind a tree. And she kind of did a double take and was staring at him. It's, it's broad daylight, it's the morning, and they're near a trail, so it isn't like unbelievable that there might be someone near her at that very moment. But she kind of did a double take and she looked at them again, and this person was gone. And she stood there for a minute, just kind of looking in the direction of where she had seen this guy, wondering, is my mind playing tricks on me? Did I really see someone there? Why aren't they showing themselves again? If there was someone there, they clearly must have just been looking at me. Why aren't they, poking their heads out again to communicate with me in some way? We're out in the middle of nowhere. We should be talking to each other. But the guy never shows himself again. And so as she's standing there wondering what she should do, she isn't ready to yell out to this person because there's part of her that's a little bit nervous about yelling out to some stranger in the middle of the woods. but she starts to get this really intense feeling that she's being watched. And it feels an awful lot like the sense of dread she had while she was in the tent. And she's starting to wonder, are my instincts or is my sixth sense picking up that I'm being watched? Like there's some predator out there looking at me right now? And even though she has no way of knowing if that's actually true, she's alone in the middle of the woods, and even though she's experienced, she can't help but feel really vulnerable. And because this guy is just not showing himself again, she feels a little bit threatened. And so she begins to panic and she starts packing up all of her stuff as quickly as she can, and as soon as she can, she takes off down the trail away from that guy she saw in the woods. As she was walking down this trail, she couldn't help but think someone was right behind her, and she kept turning around to see if this person or whoever it was behind her, and no one was ever there. But this visceral feeling that she was being watched, that sense of dread she had, it just was not going away. And so she started walking faster and faster. Before long, she was running, and she's realizing that she's in a section of the Appalachian Trail that's very remote. She's not near civilization. She's not near her next rendezvous point. And so she's thinking to herself, I need to get off this trail. I need to get to a road. I need to get away from here as soon as I possibly can. And so her options were to continue on this trail for several miles, and it would probably take her until well into the night before she was going to reach civilization, or she could take a shortcut, because she believed there was a road that was running parallel to her trail, but it was way down the mountain. It would require leaving the trail and basically cutting through the wilderness to get down to this road, but she was pretty confident it was right down there. And because this threat of this person or thing following her was so intense for her, she decided to leave the trail. She couldn't stand the idea of having to spend another night out in the middle of the woods with this person stalking her. And so she walks up the trail and starts running down the mountain. It wasn't long before she started to hear audible sounds coming from what she believed to be this person that was following her. And she would turn around and there'd be no one there. And then she started to walk, trying to listen as she's walking, and she would hear footsteps far away from her, and she'd turn and there'd be nobody there, but she was certain someone was following her, someone was stalking her. And the sounds that were coming out of this person, this animal, whatever it was, they sounded like, a deep male voice, but you couldn't recognize if it was a language of some kind. It just sounded more like a grunt or a yell of some kind. And so her heart rate's elevated, she's panicking, and she's walking as fast as she can just through the middle of the wilderness, hoping she's walking towards this road. But after walking and running for miles into the middle of nowhere, she has not come to a road. It's now completely dark out, and she knows she's lost. And so she has to set up camp in the middle of nowhere, and she knows somewhere out in the middle of the woods is some person or something that is stalking me. And she's all alone. She has no way to contact anyone. She doesn't have a cell phone. It's 1989. And so she sets up her campsite and she gets in her tent. She zips it up and she lays there hoping she doesn't hear any sounds. And sure enough, within minutes of being inside of that tent, she starts hearing those audible sounds coming from somewhere in the forest. And she hears what sounds like heavy footsteps walking around the perimeter of her campsite. All night long, she hears this. But luckily, they don't come up right to her tent. So there's some separation between her and whatever is making these sounds. And then finally, the sun comes up. She is out of that tent, packs it up, and continues running in the direction she hopes is the road. And of course, all day long, she has that sense that someone is watching her. She's hearing footsteps coming from behind her. She would turn. She doesn't see anything. She would hear that audible grunting sound, that low voice coming from somewhere behind her. But again, she would never see whoever it was or whatever it was that was making the sound. And then again, the sun is starting to set and she has not found the road. She hasn't found a trail. And she's thinking to herself, I can't even backtrack because if I turn around and start walking backwards, I'm bound to run into this very thing I'm trying to escape. And so once again, she sets up her campsite in the middle of nowhere. She gets inside, and as soon as she's laying in her tent, she starts hearing those heavy footsteps somewhere out in the woods, kind of walking around the perimeter of her campsite. She's hearing that low, audible sound that she can't quite place. And at some point she falls asleep. She gets up the next morning. She jumps out of her tent, packs it up, and starts running, hopefully in the direction that will bring her to civilization. A couple days later, when Eloise was supposed to meet her friend on the trail at the 7-day mark, and they were going to finish the hike together, well, Eloise doesn't show up. But after several hours, when Eloise did not show up, her friend left the trail and contacted authorities and filed a missing person report. And the police would launch this massive search for Eloise along the stretch of the Appalachian Trail where she had said she would be. And for the next 14 days, hundreds of police and volunteers and helicopters are scouring this area, and there's no sign of Eloise. And so after 14 days from the time her friend filed the missing person report, the police had to turn the search off, and they say, look, we can't find her. Two days after the search was terminated, so 23 days after Eloise had initially set off for her trek through the Appalachian Trail, a hunter that was out in the middle of nowhere near the Appalachian Trail discovers Eloise perched up against a tree. She's totally emaciated, she's dehydrated, she's delirious, but she's alive. At first, she was terrified of the hunter because she believed the hunter was this person that had been following her. But when she realized he was there to help, she went with him, she was brought back and brought to a hospital, and she was checked out, and besides being dehydrated and, emaciated, she was okay. And she would detail in multiple interviews and in her official statement that she had been chased for the past almost 3 weeks in the middle of the woods, and she doesn't know who it was or why they were chasing her. And then interestingly, she said right before she was found, so a couple of days before this hunter finds her, this person, this thing, whatever it was that was following her, got so close to her a couple different times that she was so scared she ditched her backpack that contained all of her life-saving equipment, like her sleeping bag and her tent, and it had some food and water in there. She ditched that so she could be lighter, so she could run faster away from this thing that is chasing her in the woods. So you gotta figure, you gotta be at such a high level of fear that you're prepared to ditch the one thing you really require to survive out in the wilderness, which was her pack full of supplies. And then, after she's ditched her pack and she's run for some distance, she's got no supplies, no food, no water, she stumbles across this tree in the middle of nowhere that wedged inside the trunk is a cache of donuts and pound cake. And so she takes the donuts and pound cake, and between that and the stream water she had found, that's what kept her alive for the last few days before she was found. Eloise says she has no idea what to make of her experience, and law enforcement were baffled by it as well. Some people think Eloise had a mental break, and she effectively made this whole situation up. That she really was lost in the woods, but no one was chasing her, and she was just kind of paranoid and running around the wilderness for a couple of weeks. Other people, including park rangers that work that stretch of the Appalachian Trail, believe it's possible she could have been stalked by wild men, which are basically people that live out in the mountains that are effectively feral, that live off the land, and they've been known, according to local legend, they've been known to attack park rangers, and people that live out in that area have claimed to have seen these wild men, and they kind of match the description of what she was describing. But as of right now, there's no official explanation for what happened to her other than she got lost and was found again.
Our next story is called The Dream.
On March 7th, 1975, 21-year-old Mark Hansen, along with two of his friends from college, Ben Fish and John Chidester, arrived at a parking lot on the eastern side of the Appalachian Trail. All three of the young men were in incredible physical shape and were excited to spend their spring break challenging themselves on some of the trail's most rigorous hikes. The day before they were supposed to go, they almost canceled the trip because there was this terrible weather system that was coming over the trail, and they were thinking, it's going to be dangerous, it's not such a good idea. And then they started talking some more, and they were like, well, we're already going to, challenge ourselves. It would be even more challenging to hike these really difficult trails with the inclusion of bad weather. So this is another way to, test our abilities. And so they kind of got pumped up at the idea of hiking the Appalachian Trail in terrible weather. So the guys arrive in the parking lot, the windshield wipers are furiously working to keep the pouring rain off. They hop out and they're getting soaked by the rain. They put on their ponchos, they grab their heavy packs, and they make their way over to the trail. Their plan was to move west along the trail until they hit the Tri-Corner Shelter, where they would spend their first night. The Tri-Corner Shelter is one of the many shelters along the Appalachian Trail. They are open to the public. There's no heating or electricity, but it provides shelter from the storm. You can go in there and, get in a sleeping bag and you'll be fine. But to get to the Tri-Corner Shelter, they would need to hike 16 miles, almost completely uphill, walking right into the wind, and it's raining on them, and it's supposed to snow later on, so it's just a treacherous first day. But they take off, they start walking up this trail, and after a couple of miles, John says, you know what, guys? This is awful. I think we should probably turn around. I think we've underestimated how bad this is going to be. Let's go back to the car, and we'll do this another time. But Mark and Ben were like, oh no, we are committed. We are doing this. We are not turning around. And John's like, you know what? Suit yourself. I'm not going to do that. And he turned around and he left and he went back to the car and he would pick them up when they were done. After John turned around, Mark and Ben, they felt good. They felt tough. They're going to stick this hike out. And so they take off again and Ben's in the lead. And Ben seems to be handling the poor weather and difficult hike and heavy pack a lot better than Mark is. In fact, over the next several hours, Mark would drift farther and farther back and Ben would need to wait for him and Mark would be hunched over, really just struggling with this hike. And then at some point, Mark yells to him and says, I gotta take my pack off. I can't carry this much weight up this hill until we get to the shelter. I'm not gonna make it to the shelter. And Ben would say to him, if we don't get to the shelter for some reason, you're gonna be stranded out here in this storm without any warm clothes, without your sleeping bag, without your tent, without your food, without your water. It's way too dangerous. You have to keep your pack on. And so finally Mark is convinced and he's like, oh, all right, puts his pack back on and they continue moving. About an hour later at 7 p.m., they had reached the section of the trail where they knew they were getting close-ish to the Tri-Corner Shelter. They were certainly well beyond the halfway point. But it was dark out, the temperature had dropped significantly. At this point, Ben is basically Mark's cheerleader, kind of egging him on to keep moving, and Mark's kind of staggering along this trail, and Ben and Mark are just hoping that shelter just appears at some point here because they don't know how much farther they can go. Another hour and a half goes by. They still haven't made it to the shelter. Mark is groaning. He can barely move. It's pitch black. The rain has now completely shifted over to snow, and it is just dumping snow on them. And Ben is concerned that, somehow did we take a wrong turn, even though they were on a really well-marked trail, and he knew they hadn't. He figured they must be so close at this point. And it was around this time that Mark yells out to Ben, I'm done. I can't go any farther. And he sits down right in the middle of the trail. He's sitting down with his pack, and he's just laying there, and Ben is like, come on, we're so close. You can't sit down now. And Mark's like, I'm not moving. I can't do any more. I'm going to sleep right here. Ben knows this is a bad idea. I mean, they did have warm clothes and sleeping bags, and they probably would be just fine sleeping out in the middle of the trail, but it just seemed so unnecessarily risky when there's probably a shelter maybe a couple 100 meters away, and he would turn out to be right. And so he decides he's going to walk ahead on the trail, and he's going to see if the shelter's there, but he only went about 100 meters. He was within maybe 100 meters of the actual shelter, but he never saw it. And so after going ahead and feeling like, man, I don't want to drag Mark any farther, if there's no shelter ahead, for all we know, we took a wrong turn. And so he turns back around and he goes back near Mark, not next to him, but close enough to him that he can see him. And he sits down on the trail too. He gets his sleeping bag out, he crawls inside, and he falls asleep. That night, Ben would have this vivid, horrible nightmare where he heard Mark screaming for help, yelling for Ben to come save him as he's being dragged off the trail into the forest. And it scared him so much that Ben woke up and he looks down the trail to where Mark is, and he can see Mark's backpack is sitting right on the trail. And so he thinks, oh, Mark's still there. And he's so tired, he's not about to get up and go check. He's like, that was just a dream. And he goes back to sleep. The next morning when the sun comes up, Ben gets up again, and the first thing he does is he looks over at Mark, and he sees the pack, but he realizes that Mark is not there. It's just the backpack. And so Ben jumps up and he yells for Mark. He doesn't get a response. He's looking around thinking he's got to be around here, but he's not. It snowed that night, so any tracks Mark would have left to show where he went to were now covered up. And that's when it dawns on Ben that that dream he had the night before, that might have been real. And he has this sinking feeling that something horrible has happened to Mark and that he didn't save him. And so he thinks, I gotta get authorities. He grabs his bag. He leaves Mark's there because he's thinking maybe he'll come back and he'll grab it. And Ben turns and runs down the trail in the direction he hopes is towards this Tri-Corner shelter. And he can't believe it when literally 200 meters away, he finds the Tri-Corner shelter. They were that close. And inside are other hikers. He was able to get one of them to run down and get Park Services to know that they have a missing hiker on the trail. Searchers were dispatched to the area where Mark and Ben had been sleeping on the trail. The first thing they did is they went to his bag, and inside were all the things he would need to survive out in the wild. His tent, his warm clothes, his sleeping bag, his food, his water, everything. It was all left there. Over the next few days, hundreds of searchers combed the area. They had helicopters overhead, and they made no significant discovery. However, one park ranger discovered this huge cave that was not that far away from where they had been sleeping. And inside of this cave, this ranger said a large mammal had been staying recently. It was not there now. And there was all these animal bones inside the cave. So it was obviously a predator of some kind. And so there was speculation that between this cave that probably held, a bear or something like that, and Ben's dream that probably was reality of Mark being pulled off the trail screaming for help, that maybe Mark was attacked by some animal that dragged him away. On the 9th day of the search, Mark's body was found. It was located 3 miles down the hill from where he and Ben had been sleeping up on that trail. Mark was positioned up against a tree. His jacket was open, his gloves were off, and his boots were off, and they were placed right next to him. An autopsy concluded he must have died within 24 to 36 hours of leaving that trail. So there's lots of questions with this one, namely, why did Mark, in the middle of the night, get up, not tell Ben where he was going, and then leave the trail and walk 3 miles away? The trail they were on was very well worn, that even at night in a snowstorm, it would be very obvious if you were on the trail or if you were off the trail. So Mark had to have known he was leaving the trail. But even if Mark had a great reason for wanting to leave the trail, just hours earlier, he couldn't even stand. That's why they were even laying on the trail to begin with, because he couldn't go any farther. So the idea that he can just jump up in the middle of the night and navigate this really difficult terrain for 3 miles in total darkness in the snow, that doesn't make sense either. And then you have Ben's dream, where he hears Mark screaming for help, and he's yelling for Ben to come save him as he's getting dragged off the trail. There's a good chance what Ben was hearing and seeing in his dream was actually playing out just several feet away from him down the trail.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Big Footprint.
In early July of 1953, Mr. and Mrs. Huggin, along with their 3 young daughters, left their home in Winnipeg, Canada, for a 6-week summer vacation. They were headed to the girls' grandparents' summer cabin in Wade, Ontario, which is one of the more remote and wild sections of Ontario. Their cabin was right in the middle of this huge swampy forest, and they were not too far from one of the biggest lakes in Ontario called Fox Lake. The family arrived late on July 4th, so they didn't do anything when they arrived. They just hung out at the cabin. And then early the next day, all the adults decided they wanted to take the girls to Fox Lake for the day. So they began gathering all the supplies they would need while the 3 girls played outside the cabin. Now, there's no neighbors or anybody else anywhere near this cabin. And so it was totally normal to have the girls just play outside. They were not concerned about, them getting taken or something. And so the two older girls played in the front yard of the cabin, and Geraldine, the 5-year-old, was playing on the side of the cabin. So the two girls in front couldn't see Geraldine, and the adults, they were keeping their eye on all 3 girls, but they were mostly just kind of going in and out of the cabin, getting their stuff together, periodically poking their head out, but the girls were fine. At 10 a.m. that morning, the parents had finally packed up the car, and they were ready to collect the girls to head over to the lake. And so they went outside, they got the 2 girls that were out front, and they went to the side of the house, and they couldn't find Geraldine. Now, they weren't worried because where could she have gone? And so they walked around the house, they're yelling for Geraldine, and they asked the 2 girls, have you seen Geraldine? Where'd she go? And they're like, oh, we don't know. She was just over on the side of the house a minute ago. And so they can't find her outside. And so they go in the cabin thinking she must have gone in there because that's the only place she could be. But after thoroughly looking through the cabin and not finding her, they started to get a little bit more worried. At this point, the adults start talking to each other and they're saying, did anybody see Geraldine in the past couple of minutes? Has anybody seen her? And they all said, yeah, I poked my head out the window and I saw her within the past 10 minutes right on the side of the cabin. And so they all agreed within the past 10 minutes, they had seen her right outside the cabin. So they're alarmed they can't find her, but they're thinking, we're gonna find her. They go back outside and they're looking around and they're yelling for her. Now, this is such a remote section of Ontario that there's really no noise pollution and sound travels really, really well. And so when they were yelling her name, it was booming through the woods. And even if Geraldine had, sprinted for 10 minutes away from the cabin, she still easily would have been within earshot. And all she had to do was just, yell back and they would see her. But she didn't yell back and there was no sign of her anywhere. And so at this point, the family is panicking. And so they call the police. The police show up and they're looking around thinking, we're not going to be able to search this very effectively on our own. This is a huge, wild, remote section of Canada. And so they called in some professional trackers that were familiar with this area to come in and help them with their search. They also called the army in Winnipeg to send over some people to assist as well. But as soon as the search started, the skies opened up and dumped rain all over the entire area, basically washing away any footprints that they could have used to potentially find her. As the day wore on and the sun was starting to set and there was still no sign of Geraldine, her father said something to the searchers that was intended to help them find his daughter, but it was just this incredibly heartbreaking comment. And what he told them was his daughter was afraid of the dark, and that once it got dark out in the woods here, she's just going to sit down and cry. And so that will stop her from moving farther away from us, hopefully, and we should be able to find her. But they didn't. And for 3 days, they looked everywhere for her, and there was no trace of her. And to make matters even worse is the weather had been really rainy and cold, not below freezing temperatures, but close, like in the 40-degree Fahrenheit range. And she just had a light shirt and shorts on. She was not prepared for the weather. On the evening of the 3rd day, they found footprints that they believed to be Geraldine's high up on this ledge in some moss overlooking Fox Lake. And the footprints indicated that this child, which was probably Geraldine, was looking out over the lake and then turned around and walked away from the ledge down into the swamp where her footprints dissipate. And so the search effort was pushed to this swamp, and they had thousands of people that are combing through this mosquito-infested bush to look for this girl, and once again, there's nothing. Then, on the 7th day of the search, they find another set of footprints in the swamp around the area where they were looking for Geraldine. But it wasn't Geraldine's footprints because they were these huge prints that if it was a human print, they would need to be an enormous human being. Or these prints belonged to some enormous animal, but they were unable to determine what animal it was. At this point, although there's not really any real evidence connecting that print to Geraldine, people are starting to suspect that whoever left this print or whatever left this print has something to do with whatever happened to Geraldine. 2 days later, so 9 days after Geraldine has gone missing, some of the professional trackers were 2.5 miles away from where that large print was found in that swamp and where Geraldine's footprints were found up on that ledge. They found a piece of her plaid shirt 2.5 miles away on the eastern shore of another lake called Long Lake. And so they pushed the search effort over to that section of Long Lake, and within 24 hours, they would find Geraldine's remains. The scene where Geraldine was found was bizarre. There was very little left of Geraldine, and from what was left, it was clear there had been significant animal predation. And so initial thoughts were, she must have been attacked by wolves, that's what killed her. But upon closer inspection, they saw that her clothing had not been torn and there was no blood on her clothes. So the animal predation had most likely occurred after she was deceased because they would have been able to pick around the clothing. Whereas if it had been a wolf attack, they would have cut right through the clothes and there would be marks that obviously, she was attacked by animals. But Geraldine's remains appeared to have been dragged out of a nearby meadow to where she was ultimately located. And so they followed the drag line into this meadow and it led them to this opening where all the grass had been matted down. And investigators said it looked like something big had been laying there. And they speculated that that might have been the area where Geraldine had been killed, and then afterwards animals had dragged her over to where she was found. And so investigators are like, well, we found that large footprint in the swamp on the 7th day in the same area where we had found Geraldine's footprints, and we thought they might be connected. And now we're finding a large, what appears to be body print in this meadow that's right near where Geraldine's remains have been found. And so probably whoever or whatever left that print in the swamp is the same one that left this print here in the meadow, and therefore is probably Geraldine's killer. But this left investigators with two theories that didn't really make any sense. The first one was, okay, these prints, the swamp print and this body print, belong to an enormous person, like a giant, who ran up to the cabin and abducted Geraldine and ran off and no one saw them or heard them. And for weeks, they've managed to totally evade capture despite being, again, an enormous person lumbering through the forest. So that seemed really unlikely. One, that this giant person even existed. And two, that if this giant person existed, how could they not get caught? They're so big running through the forest, they would be easy to spot. But if you rule out the enormous person theory, you're left with the enormous predator theory, which does make more sense on the surface because there are enormous predators that have attacked humans, so that does happen. But when they looked at her remains, they ruled out a wolf attack, and really, they ruled out animal attacks. But if this is an enormous predator, how did it kill Geraldine? The family was told that unfortunately, because there wasn't enough left of her, they weren't able to determine a cause of death. And so their best guess is she was probably mauled by wild animals, but they would even level with the family and say, honestly, we don't know what did this.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes.
Oh, irgendwann erinnerst du dich dann und du hörst noch diese Lieder und du hörst die Musik von damals, die Liebeslieder und die Seemannslieder mit all dem Stolz der Seemännerschichten. Irgendjemand gibt es Frieden, aber dafür braucht es keine Kriegen. Oh, das waren ein paar peinliche Witzchen. Aber die Wälder blühen so wie damals. Die Verwandlung schreitet wieder.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen Podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows.